All right, perfect. So just kind of an overview of what you can expect. I am going to share some information about why we're here today, some information about our students. I will dive you into the research question and objectives of the study that I'm going to share today, provide some information on the existing literature surrounding this topic of allowing late work, and talking a little bit about how my research jives or does not jive with that existing research. And then I'll move you through the study proper. So we'll talk about the methodology, the results. We'll have a little discussion about it. I will share some recommendations for going forward, and then I'll just have my works cited and we can Q&A. So that's what you can expect. Justin, you are right on it. I appreciate it. So let's talk about our students for a minute, because at its core, right, that's what this is. Not only our jobs are all about, but that really is what this presentation is about. And I want to share a little bit about sort of how my educational philosophy has changed and how that informed the research. And one of the biggest things that I think for me was the adjustment was actually being realistic with myself about who our students are versus who, as an educator, I was sort of supposed to conceive of them being. So one of the questions I want to just ask you to start, I don't know if anybody remembers, but President Temple in our December graduation shared a number of what percentage of our graduates worked while they were going to school. So if you don't remember, totally okay. I had to actually email Kaylin yesterday to get this number because I'd already forgotten from the last time I presented it. So no judgment there. But if you have any guesses, throw them in the chat. What percentage of our students do you think, our graduates, do you think worked while working on their degree? Don't leave me hanging. Somebody threw something in the chat. I believe in you. Justin put 68. Carolyn is typing 60%. Anybody else got some guesses? All right, now admittedly, these are going to be some kind of squishy numbers, right? Because the reality is that he's sharing the percentage of our graduates, which means we are probably not including many of our DE students because many of them are not graduating from here. So that to me is always, we get a little squishy with that data, but you guys are good guessers. According to President Temple, it was actually 73%. So if we went Price is Right rules, that would go to Susan. If we go non-Price is Right rules, Carice is our closest, but you guys are all in the ballpark. So 73% of our students are working. Now, again, those are our graduates. So how does DE impact those numbers? I couldn't tell you exactly, but in my experience, most of our DE students are working. And if they're not working, they're also going to their school full time and they're playing sports or they're doing, 9 million other things. So they're probably pretty close. That also aligns pretty closely with the National Community College average, which is somewhere between 70 and 75%. So we are literally smack dab in the middle of those numbers. So I think that's probably reasonably accurate. So we're assuming roughly 70 to 75% of our students are already working in the workforce. Anybody want to take a guess how many of those students are also caregivers, meaning either they are responsible for the care of a minor child or they are responsible for the care of a parent who needs additional support? Let's throw some guesses in the chat. And again, this is national numbers. These aren't our specific students, but it is National Community College student numbers from, I think, 2020. So exact accuracy, again, a little squishy, but we've done our best. All right, we've got 50, we've got 55%. Got a couple more of you guessing, 30%, 60%. We're a little more rangy on this one. The number nationally, and again, could vary for our students, is 42% of students are either caring for aging parents or caring for children or both. Of those, would you like to take a guess how many of them are also working? So what percentage of our caregivers are also working while going to school? Anybody want to take a guess? Believe in you. All right, we got typing coming. Justin was quick on the 80%, 90, 80%. Okay, if I were to guess, I would put my numbers where you are. Nationally, they are putting those numbers actually only at 65%. I think our students' numbers are higher. In fact, I do not know a single student in my class who has a kid who does not also have a job. So if I had to guess, I would guess that our numbers are substantially higher, but nationally we're looking at least 65% of all of the parents who are coming to school are also working, probably full-time, right? So we've probably got full-time parents with kids who are also juggling school on top of that. I know that's also the situation for a lot of us, right? A lot of us are working parents. So we know intimately how hard it is to juggle all of the things, right? And yet, So often, the attitude that I was certainly trained on was like, it is my job to prepare students for the workforce, right? Any of you guys encounter that philosophy? Now, for Teralyn, that is actually probably true. Teralyn, it is probably your job to prepare students for the workforce. For the rest of us, is that actually a learning objective for our course? Probably not. Also, more often than not, the reason my students' work is late is because they are actually in the workforce, right? Like they are late because they are prioritizing their job or their kids or these other things that are really big and really important. But for a very long time while working here, despite intellectually knowing my students had jobs, I was still holding pretty tightly to this idea of like, well, I can't just let them turn things in willy-nilly throughout the semester because what am I teaching them, right? What am I teaching them? That the deadlines don't matter, that they can't do that when they go into work. They can't just show up and not turn in a presentation on time. So why would I teach them that that is okay in my classroom? And so I held a very rigid belief for a very long time regarding late work. And so my policy for most of my first 5 years here was you get one, right? One time you get to slip up because even in the workforce, we would have that. You get to be late on one assignment for any reason. You don't even have to tell me what it is. But because that's probably a time management problem, I'm going to need you to write a research paper on time management of 1 to 2 pages. And then I will take your paper like it was submitted on time. I won't take any points off. But then after that, it's a zero, and I don't really care what the reason is, right? Which, if you are preparing a kid for the workforce, is a reasonable thing to do. But if in all reality, your students are in the workforce and they're taking care of kids and they're dealing with housing security, which nationally 50% of all community college students are, and you're dealing with food insecurity, which nationally I think something like 42% of students are, then maybe my course shouldn't be the most important and flexible thing in the world, right? Like maybe this is not what should be their top philosophy. And that really crystallized for me in COVID, right? Like everything was on fire. I don't know about you guys, I was still like Clorox wiping my groceries and you couldn't leave the house. And all of a sudden now people are trying to like Zoom school their kids at home and they can't see their family. They don't have the resources they typically have. Everybody was really, really struggling. And the idea that I was still going to be like, oh yeah, but you better make sure that this, analysis of Taxi Driver is submitted on time just seemed absurd. It just seemed patently absurd that this should be the thing that my students were stressing about and staying up until midnight to try to complete. And it became this moment for me of going, okay, in my own life, I subscribe very firmly to, it was a philosophy shared by Nora Roberts. If you're not familiar with her, she's a pretty famous writer who turns out just an obscene amount of books every year. It's truly impressive, and also has a life. And someone said to her, like, how do you juggle it? How do you do all this without dropping all the balls? And she was like, oh, I drop balls all the time. The important part is to know which balls are glass and which balls are plastic. Or I've also heard them as bouncy balls, which makes it sound more fun, right? But like, what are our glass balls? What are our plastic balls? And that basically just means like, what can I afford to drop? Because I can't keep all these things in my hands, right? And there are some things that are legitimately glass balls. We can't drop them. And then there are some things that are plastic balls. And at the end of the day, yeah, she's great, isn't she? At the end of the day, if it is a plastic ball, sometimes I'm going to need to drop it. Glass balls are like, can I pay my rent? Can I make sure that my kids are fed, that I am fed? Can I make sure I'm not in an absolute mental health crisis? A glass ball does not, in my course, have to be, did you turn in this analysis of Singing in the Rain by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m., right? Like that does not actually have to be a glass ball in my student's life. It just doesn't. And accepting that, and then also accepting the fact that getting things in on time was carrying a really outsized weight in my courses, right? Like they were being penalized to an enormous degree. Yeah, absolutely. Becoming a mom myself. To be fair, I changed this policy before I had a kid, but certainly after having a kid, I was like, oh yeah. I don't. Those of you who were here at the time may remember I only got 5 days of maternity leave, so I had a C-section and was grading final exams in the hospital, and then was back at it when summer A started, and my daughter was born on the 22nd of April. So there was not, and I mean, the work got done, right? Because it was glass balls and it had to. But there was definitely an awareness of like, oh boy, all right, what truly is glass in this scenario? And I want to stress that like this is not appropriate for every discipline, right? Not every discipline has the luxury of saying, hey, if you need to be late on week 2, it's fine. Because in some disciplines, you're then in a world of hurt for week 3. That is not my discipline. So I have a privilege and I want to fully acknowledge, like, again, not appropriate for every discipline, but for my discipline, it's absolutely okay if stuff is late. It is not going to hurt their ability to meet the learning objectives. And that to me is really the core of like, what actually is it my job to teach them in a course? And the reality is, with the exception of ENC 1102, which I do think actually has a learning objective tied to the ability to like connect small tasks to a larger task. So we do really have to do it in that scaffolded order for one assignment. But outside of that, there is nothing in my learning objectives about making sure that students have good time management skills. There is nothing in my learning objectives about making sure that they are adhering to deadlines. Like literally nothing. That is not my job. Is it better? Sure, absolutely. But my job is to teach them the course content. And as long as they can get those assignments in a way that does not compromise their ability to execute the course content and the learning objectives, then for me personally, I don't think this has to be a glass ball. So that shifted my policy from you get the 1 to, hey, I'll give extensions like candy, right? That's what I started telling students. Like, just anytime you're having a problem, just shoot me a message and I will just give you extensions on everything. To what it is now, which is basically, I will just take your work late. I don't need to know why. We don't have to talk about it, but I will take it until week 15. At week 15, that is a hard drop dead deadline. There is no wiggle room on week 15. That is a glass ball. If the stuff is not to me by week 15, I cannot help you. But up until week 15, I will take it late and I will not penalize you, because the reality is, more often than not, if it is late, you had a darn good reason. And sometimes that reason is legitimately my math class had to be a glass ball, right? I absolutely cannot be late in that class, and I cannot do your class and math at the same time. And while it is easy to want to be like offended of like, well, my course is just as important as math. Sure, but my course does not have to be quite as sequenced as math, right? That is the reality. So I can afford to be a little bit more flexible. So Justin, if you don't mind jumping me a slide, that would be awesome. So I started that policy change in COVID, where I was like, I'm going to just let stuff be late. And that is something that I have carried forward since the dark days, right? And so I started to wonder, I could tell a difference in my courses. I was hearing from students, like, I cannot tell you how much this means to me. Thank you. It makes me feel cared about. Like, you've been so gracious. Like, I am literally like having panic attacks all the time about math, and it's just so comforting to not have to like freak out about your course. So I was getting these kind of anecdotal things. And if I glanced at my courses, I thought, I suspect students are performing better because I'm doing this, but I didn't really have any concrete data. So I wanted to look and assess truly how many of my students were being impacted by that change, and how much potential mastery would we have missed because of that 0 grade policy. So how many students absolutely could have handled the material, absolutely were learning the material, but we're not going to have grades that were reflecting that because I was over penalizing late work. So that was kind of the research questions that I set out to answer. In terms of objectives, I wanted to identify the number of students who would have failed if the policy had not been changed. So that's our most severe, right? The kids who would have been in the DF category and who then moved on to passing. But I was also interested in the total number of students impacted by the change. So not just my kids who went from Ds to Cs, but A's to B's, or well, other way around, B's to A's, right? Because the reality is, passing versus failing is not the only metric that matters. GPA matters, right? Sometimes that's what's necessary to pull a kid off academic probation. Sometimes that's what's necessary to maintain bright futures. Sometimes that's going to be what's necessary to help them transfer to the institution of their choice or get into grad school. So those grades do still matter. There is still an impact for those grades. I also wanted to compare the findings in my own courses to existing literature, and I wanted to be able to make some recommendations for other people who were interested in adjusting their policies accordingly. So Justin, if you don't mind jumping me over. So in terms of like, what is the existing literature? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that all the literature says exactly the same thing. There is some variety in people's experiences with this. I don't think we should be surprised by that. Students are different from school to school, right? Like, not everybody has the same students. If we're at Yale, that's going to look a lot different from being here. So I would not expect the universal, like, conclusion from literature. But there is some consistency. And what it seems to suggest is that like accepting late work is not harmful. So one of the things that most people find is that late work reveals mastery that deadlines can hide, especially because we have a tendency to over penalize, right? You get a 0 on an assignment, it is darn near impossible to come back from that. It takes 10 assignments to make up for that 0. So it is going to have a huge impact on student grades. We've also found that flexible deadlines improve learning quality, reduce stress, and increase persistence. That shouldn't come as a surprise, right? Like that's some basic logic. Students are not going to be as stressed if they know they have wiggle room, if they know they have more of those plastic or bouncy balls. And it increases persistence because the reality is that data supports the argument that community college students typically drop out not because they can't handle the work or the rigor, but because they can't handle school on top of everything else that they are dealing with. It is incompatible with also having to work and having to raise children and being food insecure and having housing insecurities. And so it is not their ability that gets them out of the classroom. It is the compatibility of school with their lifestyle. So when we make that more compatible, we're increasing student persistence. And the next piece of literature talks about that, right? That it's actually outside of the classroom barriers that are more likely to keep students from persisting and graduating. Also, they found that flexible deadlines do not inflate grades. They just reveal true academic performance. They also found, and I think this is something people worry about a lot, is like, oh, if I let students just turn in late, they're going to abuse that policy. They're going to be late all the time. And the data actually doesn't support that. By and large, the students use it when they need it, which for the most part is not all the time. Now, will you get a couple of students? Sure. But generally speaking, having done this in my classes for several years now, I don't typically have a lot of students who do this on every assignment. And when I do, it is usually the students who have been in a mental health crisis for months and have finally gotten their meds adjusted or have finally found a therapist and come back to me in week 12 and say like, I am so ashamed and I am so sorry and I know I've dropped the ball, but is there anything I can do to recover? And to me, the answer to that is like, if we believe in the summers that students can effectively execute all of the work in 6 weeks, in a summer A, in a summer B, there is no reason, at least for the way my course content is structured, that students cannot realistically also execute this content in a short time frame. So, they're going to have to put in a lot more work if they want to finish my course in 3 weeks. It's going to have to be infinitely more hours in those 3 weeks than it would have been if they had spread it out across 16 hours. But is it still technically possible? Sure. And so if they want to try, I'm going to let them try. Now, there are some things where it's going to compromise the learning outcomes. And in that case, there are some things that are not achievable. So for example, let's say I have a writing workshop and they get a certain amount of points for posting their draft in the writing workshop in order to get feedback before submitting the final draft. And then they get a certain amount of points for giving feedback to their peers. Are we going to be able to accomplish the learning objective of getting feedback from their peers and revising their paper before the final draft when they're coming into a workshop that's been closed for 4 weeks? No, we're not. So I'm not going to give them points for the draft post because they're just posting their final draft at that point. Like we're still, that is not really doing that assignment. But if they give feedback to their 3 of their peers, even if their peers don't get the benefit of that feedback, they are accomplishing the learning objective of reading someone else's work, synthesizing someone else's work, critiquing someone else's work. So they are still able to accomplish that part of the learning objective. So in that case, they would get partial credit. But for everything else where we can do the full learning objective, they will be getting full credit in my course, as long as that is in by week 15, which is our hard crystal ball, glass ball, I can't help you after that. Like I had a student write me 2 weeks after the end of the semester to be like, hey, can I turn in? And it's like, nope, absolutely not. Sorry. I can help you everywhere else, but like grades are done, friend. I cannot take this paper, 2 weeks at the end of the semester, but can I help you before that? Sure. Justin, if you don't mind jumping me once, that would be lovely. Thank you. So let's talk about the methodology. I want to acknowledge this is not a perfect study because I'm looking retroactively. We do not have like a firm control group by any stretch of the imagination. But we do have a fair amount of data. So to give you kind of a picture of where we're pulling this data from, I looked at 4 semesters. I started in spring of 24, looking at the courses. So I looked at spring 24, fall 24, spring 25, fall 25. And that gave me 570 students across a little more than 20 course sections. So primarily those are concentrated in film classes, theater classes, composition classes, and creative writing. And then basically what I did was I just looked at like, okay, what were were the actual final grades in this course. And then I went by hand, it was a bit of a pain, and looked at every single student and all of their assignments across the semester to look at any late submissions. And then I changed the grade from, let's say they got a 90 on that late submission, to a 0. So I basically just subtracted 90 points from their final grade to see what would their grade have looked like if that late grade had been a 0 instead of the actual grade that they received on the assignment. And so I calculated that out for every kid in every class for every late assignment over the course of the semester. So I was able to arrive at what would have been the grade if I had not accepted work late versus what was the grade that they actually earned because that late work came in. Now, is this a perfect system? No. For example, there was one semester where we had a hurricane. And so like I probably would have been very flexible on those deadlines regardless of where we had been in the semester. So, or where I had been in my grading policies. So, it's impossible to be like 100%, or like maybe the students wouldn't have turned in that assignment late if they had known it was going to have a hard 0. So, there's third variable issues for sure, but I think it gives us a pretty good picture of where we likely would have been. And then I calculated out, okay, what would the DF rates have been in these classes? I did not look at withdrawals because I can't. The students are out of my grade book at that point. So I can't tell you anything about the kids who withdrew or what their grades would have looked like. So I'm just looking at DFs. How many would I have had if I hadn't taken the late work versus how many did I actually wind up with at the end of the semester? More often than not, those DFs were literally students who just never turned a single thing in. So it still was not a content ability question. It just was, they literally turned nothing in. And then I calculated out, I looked at my pass rates as well, and I looked at students with letter grade improvements. So I also looked at, the kids who went from B's to A's, and I calculated out the magnitude of letter grade jumps. So I was interested in not just how many students went from B's to A's, but also what percentage of my students improved by 1 letter grade, 2 letter grades, 3 letter grades, and 4 letter grades. Justin, if you don't mind jumping me, that would be great. So key findings, this was, I think, the most where I was like, oh, I'm really glad I made this change. Late work reduced D and F grades in my class by 68%. I would have had 144 students fail across my courses across that 2-year period. Instead, I had 46. So that is a huge reduction in fail rates. And again, I want to point out, like, every one of those kids had the ability to master the material, right? Every one of those kids who would have failed that passed, it had nothing to do with their ability. It had everything to do with their ability to turn in a paper by Sunday night. So we're just seeing that's hidden mastery, right? That's roughly 198 kids with hidden mastery that would have disappeared had we had that late policy in place. Pass rates increased by 17.2%. So they went from 74.7% on average across all my classes to 91.9%. So huge bump in my overall pass rates. 209 students, which represents just over a third of the students, experienced meaningful grade changes. 112 of those just improved their grade. 97 of them were what I would call rescue passes. So it was kiddos who would have had an F or a D and wound up with a C or higher. 88 students improved by more than 2 letter grades. So that is a big number of kiddos who saw a substantial jump. 24 improved by 3 or more letter grades, and 19 improved by 4 letter grades. So they wound up with A's when they would have had F's. So, that's not a huge number of students, but it's pretty substantive of kiddos who absolutely understood the material, absolutely had the ability to master the material, and just had stuff going on in their lives that made those late submissions necessary for them. But they all mastered those learning outcomes. They still finished the semester doing everything that I, as a teacher, am asked to make sure they can do, and doing it excellently, right? Those A papers in particular. So Justin, if you don't mind, thank you. The biggest impact for my students, at least, was in my hybrid courses. Without late work, only 51% of them would have passed. With late work, 91% of them passed. My online courses, that was only actually a 15-point pass rate gain. Now, if you asked me to guess why that number is so high, I don't think that would be a substantive in every course. I think that is specific to my disciplines, because during the time of this study, we were, to paraphrase Mean Girls, trying real hard to make hybrid happen, right? Like, there was a real institutional determination that we were going to put students in a hybrid film class, whether they wanted to be in it or not. And they did not want to be in it. That was very clear by the absolutely no enrollment that course carried, but we refused to open up seats in online classes. We played a game of chicken, and then I wound up with like 20 kids who enrolled 2 days before the start of the semester because they kept hoping for online, couldn't get it, and then finally managed, okay, we give up, we'll take the hybrid class. But those kids' lives were not suited for a hybrid class. They were working, they were not in a position to handle it. It was not a good fit for them by any stretch of the imagination. And so performance in those classes were bad. It was not good. They were not showing up. Like, it was really a struggle. And if I had not also allowed that late work, we would have had huge, huge, huge failure rates there. We saw the biggest gains in Intro to American Cinema, Theater Appreciation, and Comp 1. If I had to guess why those were the biggest gains, it's because for the majority of students, for the majority of the time, those were my courses that were gen ed. And so my courses that were more elective based, those are students who really want to be there. Those are students who are really excited about the course content. They are typically going to perform better. They're going to show up and do the work because they're excited about it. Whereas the students who are taking it gen ed, it's maybe the best of the options, but it's not necessarily something that they are like, staying up at night because they're so excited to write their short story or their screenplays. DF reductions by semester, spring 2024 saw the largest with 84%. Fall was then down to 77%. And then when we looked at the next year again, it was reduced to 54% and 60%. So it is large kind of across the board, but we do see the biggest impact in spring of 24. Why that is exactly, I don't know. Maybe it's AI, so maybe a lot of the kids who would have previously not turned stuff in are just cheating. I do think that's possible, but it's it's hard to say specifically and exactly. I will say I had a hybrid film that spring where the kids in particular really did not want to be there, so I think that is kind of inflating those numbers. But what I do think we can say is that we're catching probably half of the kids who would have failed and preventing that regardless of what semester we're looking at least 50% of them are getting rescued. And I think that is still a very important, valid number that we want to try to capture. Justin, if you don't mind jumping me again. So in terms of some conclusions and recommendations, I do think it is valuable to accept late work. How you do that is going to depend a lot on your discipline and what works for you. So what I have seen some instructors do is say, okay, I'm going to divide this into units and I will take your work late until the end of this unit. But after that unit is done, we're done. So they're not taking work from week 3 and week 15, but they might take work from week 2 and week 4. And if that is what works for you, or you have a class that builds on itself, I think that's a perfectly viable and good way to work. I will say, if your fear is just, I do not want to constantly be grading these assignments until I die, that's fair. But honestly, it's not as much as you'd think. It adds maybe 5 minutes to my workload in any given week. And it makes a really big difference for the students. So I would say, look at what works in your courses, look at what works for your sanity and your mental health, and then make some decisions based on your specific subject matter. Obviously, if things build, you can't let that, and it may be that you can let some assignments be late and not others, right? Like, you don't necessarily want the student turning in the outline assignment and the annotated bib assignment on the same day as the final paper, because you need to be able to give feedback on that, right? Like, that's the point. That's the learning objective. So you might want to put in some harder and faster deadlines somewhere. But if you can allow late work, sometimes in ways that work for you and work for your discipline, it is going to reduce artificial barriers for our students. It is going to encourage mastery of the content. It is going to encourage persistence. And at the end of the day, that's what we're here for, right? That's the goal. So I would encourage you, if you can, to be flexible in your late work policies where appropriate, to integrate structured grace periods or assignment windows where you can. If you don't feel comfortable saying late work, then create some assignment windows, right? Give them some, this is due between this date and this date. And then technically they're still hitting a deadline, but maybe that makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. And then the other thing that I would suggest, and this is one of the big reasons I think I don't see a ton of late work in creative writing and screenwriting. Some of it is the students have chosen that course, so they're in it. But some of it is my assignments are heavily scaffolded. So they're much less likely to be late because we've been working on this sucker for, a very long time. And the deadlines to make sure that things were happening, all of those assignments were completion based. So they didn't have to give me, the world's best final draft of their story in week 4. They just had to put something in a writing workshop, right? So maybe it's a half-finished story. And then they have a whole week dedicated to focusing on revision. And then all they have to do is share with me 200 words about what they did to revise. So by the time it actually comes to submit a big assignment, the work is largely done. And then they're in a position to turn in that assignment without it being the kind of thing that's like keeping them up until 3 in the morning, because they've been doing that work over the course of the last 14 weeks. So scaffolding is another great way if you're not in a position to provide actual time for late work in your courses, or to say like, okay, I'm going to have flexible deadlines. Then maybe the option is like, okay, can we scaffold this? Can we put smaller assignments in throughout the way that are less overwhelming so that they've already done a lot of the legwork by the time the big assignment is due? So those would be my recommendations. Justin, if you don't mind kind of jumping me. But again, want to stress, not appropriate for every course, right? Like I'm not suggesting that the math people go out and eliminate deadlines. That would not be good for them. Not recommending it. But for those of us who can be more flexible. So that's my works cited. And then Justin, I think, do I have a Q&A slide? I think I do. Yes. All right. So I'm going to hush. Does anybody have any questions? I have re-enabled all your mics, so you do have to mute, like unmute if you want to talk. But you should all have that ability to speak if you want, or you can just start in the chat.
I'll just hop in here real quick. Amber, thank you very much for this. This was really interesting. I had the benefit of having heard some of this prior to today. And I'll tell you, I've actually been implementing some of your encouraged approaches in my own grade class, and it is actually working very well for my students. We have moved from a I got to get this done and I'm panicked to it's scaffolded. And so, like you said, by the time they reach that point, it's basically done already. So there's less stress, there's less panic. And I think that's working really well for my students. We'll see how it goes through the rest of the semester, but up to now, that's working beautifully. So,
gosh, that's fantastic to hear. Thank you for sharing, Kevin. That makes me so happy. Terrellyn, I thought I saw you unmute.
Yes. Oh, yes. I was going to just say thank you for sharing the literature on this, because I thought it was funny. You mentioned because of workforce, I'm preparing them for the workforce, but I'm also preparing them for life in general. And with that comes obstacles, right? So I have the whole thing that, I would prefer quality over on time. So, and complete rather than on time. So I want the students to do the assignments, whether they turn them in on Monday or Tuesday after the deadline or next week after the deadline, rather than not do it at all. So even if it's a low point assignment, so they're like, oh, I could get a 0 on this. I don't want them to miss that assignment. So, but I've always been criticized for taking the work after the deadline by some of my peers that teach the same course, and I'm sure Kevin knows some of this from being in supervisory role. But and a lot of it's because I'd rather them turn the work in.
Absolutely.
Because I want them to meet those objectives and get that content. I mean, if they don't, do their coping skills worksheet or their self-improvement plan, they're not going to have that knowledge or that content, when they leave my class. So I feel like, that's important. So I'm glad you shared your research, of course, and then the literature review, because I'm constantly, I've been criticized for that in the past, but for my discipline, especially right now, it's an elective course. So, it's a very, big course across the college, and I tell them, now, I always preface it with they're going to have, time management skills when it comes to like math and science, and a lot of those, especially those core classes for their major. And yeah, math, you can't miss, deadlines because you'll be behind. So, but I appreciate, and that's why I attended, because I wanted to hear what you had to say about that, because I just think it's so important sometimes for them to just get the content rather than.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean. So anyway, but yeah, and I changed my deadlines to Monday too for that class, because I thought at least they don't have to stress so much on Sunday night when they have like 10 other things to do.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I also think it's worth noting that like even that argument of like I'm preparing them for the workforce. Let's be real. If you have one thing that you're late on at work, you're not fired. That's not really how it works. And no one is like, oh, well, I wanted it yesterday, and so now just don't even give it to me at all. I won't even look at it, right? Like we're late all the time. Like, I mean, there are some things where it matters, right? Like I'm not turning in my final grades late. Somebody's gonna be really mad at me. So there are some things where that is really important in the workforce. There are some things that are truly crystal balls, which is why I hold very tightly that like week 15, we're done. There is no more wiggling here. But that no one is as inflexible in the workforce as we often think we have to be with our students. So even that idea of like, I'm preparing them for work, it's like, they're not really. Like people are late all the time. Yeah. I was chasing down faculty this week being like, guys, it's the deadline. Please, I need your scoring for this thing. We have to tell students tomorrow. Please send me your things. And like, there's still things I didn't get. And nobody's fired, right? Like, it's not, there has been no public flogging of the person who didn't send me their scores. So it's just one of those things where, like, I think we've gotten very caught up in this idea that we have to do this because it's our job and we have to make sure they're never, ever, 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 ever late on anything. But, like, it's just not real. It's not real life. It is not real workforce preparation, and it is not realistic in actually honoring who our students are and where they're coming from. So thank you for affirming my feelings on that. I appreciate it. Susan, you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And even though I'm from the discipline of nursing, which is a different process, there is still flexibility in some of our assignments that are not exam-based. And I just love what your analogy with Nora Roberts, because our students, we see that. We see students that work a 12-hour night shift, come in for a 9 o'clock class after they got off of work at 7 a.m. And we wonder why they're falling asleep at 12.
Right.
And you have to be realistic. But I love that because the analogy of which ball do you drop, and I think even within the discipline of nursing, which is rigid, and sometimes there are implications for being late for things,
right? Absolutely.
Certainly in the clinical world, but there's still room for flexibility because, yes, is this a glass ball or is it not? When they are still a student learning to be that nurse. So although we have assignments, 90% of our assignments are exam-based, there's a 10% that is a completion of a case study by a date. And I was flexible last semester in accepting lateness because that's just been my philosophy really for a long time, understanding the position of the students. And of course, as I accepted some late assignments, I then had other students say, well, could I redo my assignment to get a better grade? And so again, that consists, which to me was two different issues, because the assignment was, since it was completion based, it was case studies designed to help them learn material for the exam. And they could do the assignment several times in the Elsevier product and get a better score according to a rubric. But, since I accepted some late ones, now the student who put it in on time and didn't get the full points wanted to redo it. And so that's where yes, you can be flexible, but you have to set up the
yeah, you gotta have the fence posts. The fence posts are important. And I think, that's a beautiful place for us to end on, of like, the goal for me is always give grace where you can. So sometimes you can't, and that is okay. But where you can, I think it's always valuable to try to give grace. And I think you're also right of like, you have to be aware of fairness, right? And you have to be very clear about the rules going in. So in my class, they always have the option to revise, but that's because I teach a discipline where revision is not only like, okay, it's necessary. Like, you're teaching writing, you should be revising. Whereas like with nursing, I don't want somebody coming in and being like, here's your medication. Just kidding. I've given that wrong. I'll be right back. Like, that is not a revision-based discipline. So I think, there are places where we can have more or less flexibility, more opportunities, grace where we can. And some disciplines allow for more of that, and some disciplines allow for less. But where we can, I think, is always a beautiful place to be. So I would love to continue this conversation.
But data to convince some of our colleagues.
Yes, happy to share. If there's anything I can share out, feel free. You guys are welcome to email me anytime. I'm happy to share the research that I've got with any of you, or if you're like, hey, like when I gave this presentation the first time, Misha came, and my first thought was like, Misha's going to eat me alive. Like, Misha is the hardest core person I know about deadlines. And she stayed with me 2 hours after this presentation to be like, talk to me more, talk to me more, talk to me more. So if you have a Misha and you're like, can I just send somebody to you? And you can talk to them about this, I'm happy. I will bang this bell all day long. So if there's anybody that you want me to share data with, if you want data, if there's anything I can do to support, I'm always here.
That'd be great.
I know we're 2 minutes past time, and I want to be respectful of the fact that we have a very jam-packed day. But you guys are always welcome to email me. It's just Carlin's A. I'm easy to find. But this has been a joy. Thank you for joining me. I hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you.
It's great.
Much appreciated.